Somewhere in the Vatican secret archives, there is a manuscript. Or there was. The story goes like this. In 1139, Saint Malachy, Archbishop of Armagh, the most senior churchman in Ireland, a man of documented holiness and considerable administrative ability, traveled to Rome to present 2 wool palliums to Pope Innocent II. While in Rome, he experienced a vision. In this vision, he was shown the entire future succession of the papacy, every pope who would ever sit on the throne of St. Peter, from his own time until the end of the world. He recorded this vision as a sequence of 112 short, cryptic phrases in Latin. Each phrase described one pope. Together, they constituted a complete prophetic history of the Catholic Church, from the 12th century to the Last Judgment. He gave the manuscript to Innocent II. Innocent II placed it in the Vatican archives, and then for 451 years nothing. No mention of it in any document. No reference to it in any chronicle. No citation of it in any theological debate. No copy of it in any library. No trace of it in any correspondence between any of the dozens of popes, thousands of cardinals, and tens of thousands of clergymen who passed through the Vatican in the 4.5 centuries between Malachy's visit and the manuscript's supposed rediscovery. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was Malachy's closest friend. He was present at Malachy's death. He wrote Malachy's biography, a detailed, loving account of the man's life, his miracles, his holiness, his administrative achievements. It is one of the primary sources for everything we know about the historical Malachy. It does not mention the prophecy, not once, not in passing, not as a rumor, not as something Bernard had heard about but could not verify, not as something Malachy had mentioned to him in private, not as something that anyone, anywhere, had told Bernard about in the years following Malachy's death. The manuscript that Malachy had supposedly placed in the Vatican archives, the document that purported to describe every pope until the end of time, was unknown to the man who knew Malachy better than anyone alive. 451 years of silence. And then, in 1590, in the middle of a papal conclave, the manuscript was found. Or, and this distinction is the entire story, a manuscript was produced. Not found, produced, written, constructed, with considerable skill and evident purpose, by someone who understood the history of the papacy well enough to describe every pope from Celestine II onward with remarkable accuracy, because those popes had already lived, and their lives were documented in a book published in 1557. And the person who wrote the prophecy appears to have relied on material available in a book published in 1557, very likely Panvinio, or a source closely related to it. The prophecy of Saint Malachy is not a prophecy. It is a forgery. The prophecy of Saint Malachy is almost certainly not a prophecy. It is best understood as a late 16th century forgery. A forgery that has been identified, analyzed, and confirmed as such by historians, by Catholic theologians, by the Catholic Encyclopedia, by the National Catholic Register, by Catholic News Agency, and by every serious scholar who has examined it with the tools of textual criticism and historical analysis. A forgery that, despite this, has been shared, cited, debated, and treated as potentially authentic by millions of people across 5 centuries, including, most recently, in the weeks following Pope Francis's death in April 2025, when the prophecy circulated across the internet with the urgency of people who believed they were watching history arrive at its conclusion. The most successful forgery in Vatican history. Not because it fooled the experts. It did not fool the experts. It was identified as a forgery within a century of its publication, and the identification has been confirmed repeatedly in the centuries since. But because it was not designed to fool experts, it was designed to answer a need. And the need it was designed to answer the need for a narrative that makes the present moment feel cosmically significant, that transforms the anxiety of institutional crisis into the excitement of prophetic fulfillment, that tells you not merely that history is happening, but that you are alive at the moment history has been moving toward all along. This need is not a medieval need. It is a human need, and it has not been satisfied, which is why the forgery is still running. 800 years after the man who supposedly wrote it died in Clairvaux, in the arms of his friend Bernard, who wrote everything down and mentioned nothing about a prophecy. This is the story of how a document that no one wrote, that described events that had already happened, that was planted in an archive to influence an election. It did not influence. It became the most enduring piece of prophetic misinformation in the history of the Western Church, and why it will still be circulating the next time a pope dies, which, given the nature of popes, will not be long. Malachy O'Morgair was born in Armagh, Ireland, in 1094. He died in Clairvaux, France, in 1148, in the arms of Bernard of Clairvaux, who had been his closest friend for 2 decades and who wept at his death with the unself-conscious grief of a man who had lost someone irreplaceable. Between those 2 dates, Malachy had one of the most consequential careers in the history of the Irish Church. He was ordained a priest at 25, an archdeacon shortly after, and was eventually appointed Archbishop of Armagh in 1132, a position he accepted with reluctance, because it required him to displace a rival claimant who had held the position by hereditary right for 15 generations, and who was not inclined to give it up without a fight. The fight was real. Malachy spent years navigating the violence and political complexity of 12th century Irish ecclesiastical politics, a world in which the institutional church was deeply entangled with the clan structures and dynastic ambitions of Irish nobility, and in which reforming the church meant, simultaneously, reforming the society it was embedded in. He did this with a combination of personal courage, diplomatic skill, and genuine spiritual authority that earned him a reputation for holiness that was, by all accounts, genuinely deserved. He reformed the Irish Church along the lines of continental practice. He introduced the Roman liturgy, where Irish custom had persisted. He established diocesan structures where they had been absent. He brought the Irish Church into closer alignment with Rome, a project that required both his administrative ability and his spiritual credibility. Because institutional reform in a world where authority is ultimately spiritual requires the reformer to be believable as a holy man, not merely as an administrator. He was believable. He traveled to Rome twice. On the second journey, in 1148, he stopped at Clairvaux to visit Bernard. He became ill during the visit. He died there on November 2nd, 1827, the Feast of All Souls. Bernard was with him. Bernard wrote his biography within a year of his death. The biography is detailed. It covers Malachy's childhood, his education, his ordination, his various ecclesiastical appointments, his conflicts with the dynastic claimants to the archbishopric, his reform of the Irish Church, his journeys to Rome, his friendship with Bernard himself, and his death. It includes accounts of miracles attributed to him during his lifetime and after his death. It is, by the standards of 12th century hagiography, a thorough and relatively reliable document. Reliable in the sense that Bernard was writing about a man he had known personally, whose life he had witnessed in part directly, and whose reputation he was invested in preserving accurately. The biography does not mention a prophecy about future popes. This is not a small omission. If Malachy had experienced a vision of the entire future succession of the papacy, if he had written down 112 cryptic Latin phrases describing every pope from his own time until the Last Judgment, and if he had given this document to Pope Innocent II during his first visit to Rome in 1800, then Bernard of Clairvaux would have known about it. Bernard was not a man who missed things. He was one of the most intellectually formidable figures of the 12th century, a theologian, a preacher, a political operator of considerable skill, and a writer whose Latin prose was among the finest of the medieval period. He was also, on the subject of Malachy, someone who was actively looking for evidence of prophetic gifts. The biography records multiple instances of Malachy's apparent ability to know things before they happened, small-scale prophetic incidents, the kind that medieval hagiography routinely attributed to holy men. Bernard included these because they supported the case for Malachy's holiness and, eventually, his canonization. If Malachy had produced a document describing the entire future succession of the papacy, Bernard would have included it. He would not have been able to help himself. It was not included because it did not exist. The argument from silence is not, by itself, conclusive proof of forgery. Documents are lost. Events go unrecorded. The historical record of the 12th century is fragmentary in ways that make absence of evidence an unreliable guide to evidence of absence. But the silence surrounding the Malachy prophecy is not ordinary silence. It is a specific, structured, extensive silence that runs not merely through Bernard's biography, but through 4.5 centuries of papal history. Consider what the papacy was. Between 1148 and 1590, it was an institution that kept records. Obsessively, continuously, in the manner of an organization that understood from bitter experience, with forged documents and disputed claims that the written record was the foundation of institutional authority. The Vatican archives that accumulated during these 4 centuries contain an extraordinary volume of material, correspondence, legal documents, theological treatises, administrative records, chronicles, and the accumulated paperwork of an institution that governed the spiritual and, to a significant extent, the political life of Western civilization. In none of this material, in none of the correspondence between popes, none of the records of conclaves, none of the theological debates about the nature of prophecy and the limits of prophetic knowledge, none of the political arguments that raged around every contested election does the Malachy prophecy appear. Not as an authority cited in support of a candidate, not as a text debated by theologians, not as a document referenced in the course of arguments about what the future of the papacy held, not as a curiosity mentioned in passing by a chronicler who had heard something about a list of papal prophecies. Nothing. For 451 years, this is not ordinary silence. This is the silence of a document that was not there. And then, in 1590, it was there. To understand why 1590 matters, why the appearance of the manuscript in that specific year is not a coincidence but a signature, you need to understand what was happening in the Vatican in the summer and autumn of that year. Urban VII was elected Pope on September 15th. 1800. He died on September 27th. 1800. 13 days. Urban VII holds the record for the shortest pontificate in the history of the Church, 13 days, during which he was too ill with malaria to be formally crowned and never actually exercised the functions of the papacy. He died before he was Pope in any meaningful operational sense. The conclave that had elected him immediately reconvened to elect his successor. This conclave, the second conclave of 1590, convened in October after Urban VII's death, was the conclave into which the Malachy prophecy appeared. The timing is suggestive enough that historians have long treated it as part of the forgery's signature. The manuscript was not found in the Vatican archives during a routine inventory. It was not discovered by a scholar pursuing an unrelated research project. It appeared or was produced, or was suddenly brought to the attention of people who found it useful at precisely the moment when a papal election was underway and the question of which candidate was divinely favored was, as always in a conclave, the central question in the room, and the manuscript, when it was examined, provided an answer. The phrase assigned to the Pope who would succeed Urban VII, the Pope who would be elected in the conclave currently underway, was ex antiquitate urbis, from the ancient city, from the old city. Cardinal Girolamo Simoncelli was a candidate in that conclave. Simoncelli was from Orvieto. Orvieto, in Latin, is urbs fatus, the old city. The connection was not subtle. It was not the kind of interpretation that required ingenuity or special knowledge. It was a direct, transparent, impossible to miss correspondence between the prophetic phrase and the identity of a specific candidate, a correspondence so convenient, so perfectly timed, and so clearly advantageous to Simoncelli's supporters, that the 17th century French encyclopedist Louis Moreri concluded, with the kind of dry certainty that characterizes scholars who have seen enough to stop being surprised, that one major theory links its circulation in 1590 to efforts on Simoncelli's behalf. Simoncelli was not elected. The conclave chose Nicolas Fondrati, who took the name Gregory XIV. The attempt to apply the phrase ex antiquitate urbis to Gregory XIV, who was from the town of Soma Lombardo, which has no obvious connection to ancient cities, required, as one historian put it, an ingenuity that bordered on the heroic, if its immediate purpose was to shape the conclave. It did not succeed, but the forgery was published anyway, in 1595. 5 years after the conclave. A Benedictine monk named Arnold Wion included the prophecy in a larger work called the Lignum Vitae. He attributed it to Saint Malachy. He included an interpretation applying each phrase to the Pope it supposedly described that he attributed to a Spanish Dominican named Alphonsus Ciaconius. This attribution was later shown to be false. The interpretation was not Ciaconius's work. But by the time this was established, the prophecy was already in circulation. The manuscript that had appeared in 1590 and failed to influence the conclave had found, through Wion's publication, a new life, not as a political tool, though it would continue to function as one, as a text, as a document that, once in print, could be read, cited, debated, and treated as potentially authentic by anyone who encountered it without access to the scholarly analysis that would have disposed of it immediately. The forgery was in the world. It was not coming back. There is a detail in the history of the Malachy prophecy's publication that tends to be overlooked in the standard accounts, but that illuminates the mechanism with particular clarity. Arnold Wion, who published the prophecy in 1595, did not claim to have found the original manuscript. He said he was publishing a copy, a text that had been in circulation, that he had encountered in the course of his research, that he was bringing to a wider audience because, as he put it, not many people knew about it. This is the standard frame for the publication of a forged document. Not I found this, but I am making this available. The responsibility for the document's authenticity is shifted. Wion presented himself less as the discoverer of an original manuscript than as the publisher of a text already in circulation. The reader could assess its authenticity for themselves. The assessment, For most readers who encountered the prophecy in the decades after 1595, was complicated by a feature of the document that made it appear far more impressive than it actually was. The feature was the accuracy of the early phrases. For the popes, from Celestine II, the first pope described in the prophecy, reigning in the 1140s, through to Urban VII in 1590, the phrases matched the popes they supposedly described with a consistency that was, to a reader who did not know that the document had been written in 1590, genuinely remarkable. Take Celestine II, the first pope in the sequence. The phrase assigned to him was ex Castro Tiberis, from a castle on the Tiber. Celestine II was born in Città di Castello, city of the castle, which stands on the banks of the Tiber River. The correspondence is precise. Take Benedict XII. Assigned the phrase Frigitus Abbas, cold abbot. Benedict XII had been the abbot of a monastery at Fontfrodi Cold Spring before his election. Again, precise. Take Alexander XXX. Assigned de Ruhr Albo, from the White Countryside. Alexander III was from Siena, the city of the White Countryside, the Sienese hills, and his family name was Bandinelli, connected etymologically to white. Precisi. This level of accuracy, sustained across dozens of popes spanning 4 centuries, is extraordinary, unless you know that it was achieved by the straightforward method of writing the descriptions after the fact. The person who wrote the Malachy prophecy, whoever they were, working in the years immediately before 1590, had access to exactly the kind of reference material that would have made these correspondences possible. Onofrio Panvinio's Brief History of the Roman Pontiffs, published in 1557, provided detailed information about the birthplaces, family names, heraldic symbols, and pre-papal careers of every pope from the early church through the mid-16th century. The correspondences in the Malachy prophecy, the ones that appear so remarkably accurate, match the information in Panvinio's book with a consistency that Spanish Benedictine scholar Benito Geronimo Feijó y Montenegro, in exhaustive detail in his Teatro Critico Universal in the Buena Kiev, 18th century. Feijó's analysis was systematic and devastating. He compared the phrases assigned to popes before 1590 with the information available in Panvinio and found that the accuracy of the prophecy was exactly the accuracy you would expect from someone who had read Panvinio and written descriptions based on what they found there. He then compared the phrases assigned to popes after 1590 popes who were alive when the prophecy was published, or who had not yet been elected, and found that the accuracy dropped precipitously. The difference is not subtle. The earlier phrases look specific. The later ones increasingly require ingenuity. The boundary between the 2 periods of accuracy is not random. It is not the product of the prophecy becoming vaguer over time, or of the later popes being harder to describe. It is the boundary between the popes whose lives had been documented in sources that the forger had access to and the popes whose lives had not yet happened. The prophecy is accurate about the past because it was written about the past. It is inaccurate about the future because no one can write accurately about the future. The numbers make the forgery visible. They made it visible in 1724. When Feijó published his analysis, they make it visible now. They have always made it visible to anyone who looked. The question is not why the forgery was exposed. The question is why the exposure did not end it. In the summer of 1590, the papal throne changed hands twice in less than 3 months. This was not unprecedented in the history of the Church. The medieval period had produced pontificates measured in days, in weeks, in the brief intervals between one man's death and another's election, but it was unusual enough, in 1590, to produce the specific combination of urgency and instability that makes institutional actors reach for tools they would not otherwise consider. The first death was Sixtus V, who died on August 27th after a pontificate of 5 years. Sixtus had been a formidable pope, energetic, autocratic, administratively ambitious, and possessed of a vision of the papacy's role in the political landscape of late 16th century Europe that had brought him into conflict with almost every major power on the continent. He had rebuilt Rome. He had reorganized the Curia. He had made enemies with the systematic thoroughness of a man who found opposition useful as confirmation that he was doing something significant. He died, and the College of Cardinals assembled to elect his successor. The College of Cardinals in 1590 was a body shaped by decades of counter-Reformation politics. The Council of Trent had concluded in 1563, and the generation of cardinals who had implemented its reforms, who had navigated the complex relationship between the institutional church and the Protestant challenge, between the papacy and the Catholic monarchies of Spain and France, between the theological imperatives of reform and the political imperatives of survival, was the generation now assembled in the Sistine Chapel to choose the next pope. These were not naive men. They were among the most sophisticated political operators in Europe, men who understood power, who understood institutions, who understood the specific dynamics of a conclave in which every vote was simultaneously a theological judgment and a political calculation. They were also men under pressure. The pressure was external. The wars of religion that had been tearing Europe apart for decades showed no sign of resolution. The pressure was internal. The reform agenda of the Counter-Reformation had created factions within the Church itself, reformers and conservatives, Spanish clients and French clients, men who believed the papacy needed to project strength and men who believed it needed to project holiness. The pressure was theological. The question of what kind of pope the moment required was genuinely contested and genuinely important. In this environment, urgent, politically charged, theologically loaded, the college assembled and, after a conclave of some duration, elected Cardinal Giambattista Castagna. He took the name Urban VII. He was 69 years old. He was known as a man of personal holiness and considerable administrative experience. He had served as a papal legate, as an inquisitor, as a governor of papal territories. He was, by the standards of the moment, a reasonable choice, a candidate who could command sufficient support from different factions to be elected, while not being so committed to any single faction as to make his election a victory for that faction alone. He was elected on September 15th. He died on September 27th. 13 days. He never received the formal coronation that would have made him pope in the full ceremonial sense. He spent most of his 13 days ill enough that the administrative machinery of the papacy effectively suspended itself, waiting to see whether the new pope would recover sufficiently to begin functioning. And discovering that he would not, he died of malaria, and the College of Cardinals, which had just completed one conclave, had to begin another. The second conclave of 1590 opened in October, in the specific atmosphere that the unexpected death of a pope always produces, a combination of grief, exhaustion, and a heightened awareness that the decisions made in the next days or weeks would determine the direction of the Church for years. The cardinals who entered the conclave brought with them the same factional alignments that had shaped the previous election, complicated by the specific lessons of Urban VII's brief pontificate. Urban had been elected as a consensus candidate, a man acceptable to multiple factions precisely because he was not strongly identified with any single one. His death, before he could demonstrate what his papacy would actually look like, left the factional calculus of the conclave essentially unchanged. The major factions were organized, as they had been for most of the 16th century, around the competing interests of the great Catholic monarchies of Europe. Spain, the most powerful Catholic state in the world in 1590, the empire on which the sun did not set, the patron of the Counter-Reformation, and the defender of Catholic orthodoxy against Protestant heresy, had interests in who sat on the papal throne. A pope favorable to Spain was a pope who would support Spanish policy in the Netherlands. In France, in the Holy Roman Empire, a pope hostile to Spain was a pope who would complicate Spanish ambitions at every turn. France, or rather, the Catholic faction in France, in the middle of the wars of religion that were tearing French society apart, had its own interests. A pope favorable to France was a pope who would support the Catholic League against the Protestant claimant to the French throne. A pope hostile to France was a pope who would complicate the religious settlement that the Catholic faction needed to achieve. Between these two great powers, and independent of both, were the Italian cardinals, men whose interests were defined by the specific political geography of the Italian peninsula, by the relationships between the papal states and the surrounding Italian powers, and by the institutional interests of the Roman Curia itself. In this landscape, Cardinal Girolamo Simoncelli was a candidate. He was Italian. He was from Orvieto, a hilltop city in Umbria, ancient even by Italian standards, known in Latin as Urbs Vetus, the old city. He had served in various ecclesiastical capacities with sufficient distinction to make him a credible candidate, and he had accumulated the kind of support within the college that made him competitive without making him the obvious frontrunner. His supporters needed something. In a conclave where the decision was genuinely uncertain, where multiple candidates had significant support and the outcome could not be predicted with confidence, any additional argument in favor of a specific candidate was valuable. Any reason to believe that this candidate, rather than that one, was the right choice for the moment. What Simoncelli's supporters needed was the kind of argument that could not be countered by a better political argument or a more impressive resume. They needed a divine argument, and the divine argument appeared. The exact circumstances under which the Malachy prophecy entered the conclave of 1590 are not fully documented. What is documented is the timing and the effect. The manuscript, or a copy of the manuscript, or a document presented as a copy of a manuscript that had been found in the Vatican archives, began circulating among the cardinals of the conclave sometime during the proceedings. It was examined. It was discussed. The phrase assigned to the Pope who would succeed Urban VII ex antiquitate urbis from the ancient city was noted. The connection to Simoncelli from Orvieto, the ancient city, was pointed out. The argument was simple and within the framework of prophetic expectation that the participants inhabited. Potentially powerful. The prophecy, written 4.5 centuries ago by a recognized saint, pointed toward Simoncelli. The divine plan, visible to those with the faith to read it, had already decided the outcome. The cardinals were not choosing a pope. They were recognizing one. This argument did not work. Simoncelli was not elected. The conclave chose Cardinal Nicolas Fondrati, who took the name Gregory XIV. The attempt to apply the phrase ex antiquitate urbis to Gregory XIV, who was from Somma Lombardo, a town in Lombardy with no obvious connection to ancient cities, required, as we have noted, an ingenuity that strained even the capacious interpretive resources of 16th century prophetic exegesis. Various attempts were made. Gregory's family had ancient roots. The papacy itself was ancient. Rome was ancient. Each of these connections was more tenuous than the last, and each illustrated, with inadvertent clarity, the distinction between the accuracy of the phrases before 1590, achieved by writing the descriptions after the fact, and the vagueness of the phrases after 1590, which had to be applied to popes who had not yet been described by anyone. The forgery had been deployed. The forgery had failed. And then the forgery was published. The decision to publish the prophecy 5 years after the conclave in which it had appeared, in a work of Benedictine scholarship that gave it the imprimatur of institutional religious learning, is the decision that transformed a failed political gambit into an enduring cultural artifact. Arnold Wion was a Flemish Benedictine monk, a scholar, and the author of the Lignum Vitae, A Tree of Life, a study of illustrious Benedictines across history. He included the Malachy prophecy in this work in 1595, attributing it to Saint Malachy and noting that the prophecy had not been widely known before its recent discovery. Wion was not, as far as the historical record indicates, a cynical operator. He was a scholar who had encountered what appeared to be an interesting historical document and included it in his research. The fact that the document was a forgery was not, in 1595, as obvious as it would become after Fajo's systematic analysis in the 18th century. The techniques of historical criticism that would eventually expose the prophecy were not fully developed in 1595. A scholar of Wion's generation, encountering a manuscript attributed to a recognized saint and bearing apparent evidence of prophetic accuracy, might reasonably have included it without subjecting it to the kind of scrutiny that a later generation would apply. Whether Wion was deceived or complicit is a question the historical record does not resolve. What the historical record does resolve is the effect of publication. Once the prophecy was in print, once it had been given the formal structure of a published document, with attribution, with an interpretive framework, with the institutional endorsement of a Benedictine scholar's larger work, it entered a different category of existence than it had occupied as a manuscript circulating within a specific conclave. It became available to readers across Europe, who encountered it without the specific political context of the 1590 conclave, and without the immediate motivation to examine it skeptically that Simoncelli's opponents might have had, available to the curious, the credulous, the genuinely devout who found in its apparent accuracy evidence of divine providence, available to the politically ambitious, who found in its ambiguous phrases a resource that could be applied, with appropriate ingenuity, to the candidate of their choice, available, in short, to everyone, and everyone, in the centuries that followed, found something in it. The first serious scholarly attack on the prophecy's authenticity came from Claude François Ministrier, a 17th-century French Jesuit, who examined the document in 1694 and concluded that the interpretation attributed to Ciaconius, the interpretation that applied the phrases to specific popes, was not Ciaconius's work at all, and that the entire document showed signs of having been composed in the late 16th century rather than the 12th. Ministrier's analysis was careful and, within the limits of 17th century historical scholarship, largely correct. He identified the discontinuity between the accurate early phrases and the vague later ones. He noted the absence of any reference to the prophecy in any document before 1587. He observed that the attribution to Malachy was unsupported by any independent evidence. His conclusion: the prophecy was a forgery, probably composed in the late 16th century. The prophecy continued to circulate. Ministrier's analysis was noted by scholars and ignored by everyone else. This pattern scholarly demolition followed by popular indifference to the demolition would repeat itself at regular intervals over the next 3 centuries. Each iteration following the same structure, a careful analysis exposing the forgery's mechanisms, a period of reduced circulation, and then a return to prominence at the next moment of papal crisis, when the need for prophetic narrative overrode the conclusions of historical scholarship, because the prophecy was not circulating because people believed it was historically authentic. It was circulating because it was useful, because it transformed the anxiety of an impending conclave, the uncertainty of who would emerge from the Sistine Chapel and what their election would mean for the future of the Church, into the excitement of prophetic fulfillment, because it told people that what was happening was not merely institutional politics but sacred history. And that transformation from anxiety to excitement, from uncertainty to meaning, from the contingency of human choice to the certainty of divine plan, is not something that historical scholarship can take away, because the need for the transformation does not go away when the scholarship arrives. It waits, and when the next pope dies, it returns. There is a letter. It dates from 1587, 3 years before the conclave of 1590, and the earliest documented reference to the Malachy prophecy that scholars have been able to find. The letter is not from Simoncelli's supporters. It is from the entourage of Cardinal Giovanni Girolamo Albani, a different candidate, with different supporters, pursuing a different strategy. The letter discusses the prophetic phrase assigned to the next pope in the Malachy sequence and argues that the phrase "derore coeli" from the dew of the sky applies to Albani because of a connection between his name and the word for dawn, which is associated with dew. The argument is, like most arguments from the Malachy prophecy, strained, but its existence in 1587, 3 years before the conclave, in the context of a different candidate's supporters, complicates the simple narrative that the prophecy was forged specifically for the 1590 conclave to advance Simoncelli's candidacy. The prophecy may have been in circulation, in some form, before 1590. It may have been used by multiple factions, from multiple candidates, before it was published by Wion in 1595. The connection to Simoncelli may have been the most obvious application of the phrase ex antiquitate urbis, but it may not have been the only application that was attempted. What this suggests about the forgery's origins is instructive. The prophecy was not necessarily a one-time political tool, created for a specific conclave and a specific candidate. It may have been a more general resource, a document that had been in circulation among the politically sophisticated clergy of the late 16th century for years before 1590, available to be applied to whatever candidate its user was supporting, in whatever conclave its user was navigating. This would explain its longevity more precisely than the simpler narrative of a single forger with a single purpose. A document that is flexible enough to be applied to multiple candidates, in multiple conclaves, across multiple decades, is a document that has institutional utility independent of any specific election. The Malachy prophecy was not a weapon designed for a single battle. It was infrastructure. Infrastructure for the transformation of institutional politics into sacred history, for the argument that the human choices being made in the Sistine Chapel were not merely human choices, but the recognition of divine appointments that had been made centuries ago and written down by a saint who was too holy to be doubted. Infrastructure that, once constructed, did not need its builders to maintain it. It maintained itself by being useful over and over again to different people, for different purposes, for 500 years. The Catholic Encyclopedia, the authoritative reference work of the Catholic Church, published in the early 20th century and updated regularly since, addresses the Malachy prophecy with the careful, measured language of an institution managing a document that it cannot endorse and cannot simply ignore. It notes the absence of any reference to the prophecy before 1590. It notes the discontinuity between the accuracy of the early phrases and the vagueness of the later ones. It notes the scholarly consensus that the document is a late 16th century composition rather than a 12th century one. It does not call it a forgery. In so many words, the institutional vocabulary of the Church does not readily accommodate the word forgery in reference to a document that has been circulating under a saint's name for 5 centuries. But it says, with the particular clarity that institutional understatement can sometimes achieve, that the prophecy is not an approved private revelation and that Catholics are not required to give it any credence. Not required to give it credence. This is the institutional Church's way of saying, this document is not what it claims to be. It is also, as it turns out, completely insufficient to stop the document from being treated as what it claims to be, because the institutional church's assessment of the prophecy's authenticity is not the thing that sustains the prophecy's circulation. The thing that sustains it is the next conclave, and the conclave after that, and the one after that, each one a new moment of uncertainty, a new opportunity for the prophecy to perform its central function, to transform the anxiety of not knowing what comes next into the excitement of recognizing what was always going to come next. The mechanism does not require the document to be authentic. It requires the moment to be anxious. And moments of papal succession are always anxious, which means the mechanism is always available, which means the forgery is always running. To forge a document is not difficult. People have been doing it for as long as documents have existed, for as long as there has been something worth faking. Some authority or property or right that a piece of writing could confer on the person who possessed it. The history of medieval Europe is, in significant part, a history of forged documents, forged land grants, forged royal charters, forged papal bulls, forged apostolic letters, forged genealogies establishing the ancient lineage of families whose actual origins were considerably more recent and considerably less distinguished. A most famous forgery in the history of the Western Church, the donation of Constantine, a document by which the Emperor Constantine supposedly granted the papacy temporal authority over the western half of the Roman Empire, was drafted sometime in the 8th century. 4 centuries after the emperor whose name it bore had died. It was used by the papacy to justify its temporal claims for 700 years. It was exposed as a forgery in 1440 by the Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla, using the same methods of textual criticism and historical analysis that would later be applied to the Malachy prophecy. The donation of Constantine continued to circulate for centuries after Valla's demolition of it. Forgery, in the medieval and early modern world, was not merely a crime or a deception. It was a tool of institutional politics, a way of creating the documentary foundation for claims that could not be supported by authentic documents, of establishing the historical precedent for arrangements that were in fact recent inventions, of giving the weight of antiquity to ideas that were the product of present necessity. The Malachy prophecy belongs to this tradition, but it belongs to a specific and particularly sophisticated branch of it, the branch that the Romans called vaticinium ex eventu, prophecy from the event. Understanding how this technique works is understanding how the forgery was constructed. And understanding how the forgery was constructed is understanding why it has been so difficult to kill. Vaticinium ex eventu is not a medieval invention. It is as old as written prophecy itself. The technique is straightforward. You write a prophecy about events that have already happened, attribute it to a figure who lived before those events, and present it as evidence of genuine prophetic foresight. The prophecy appears accurate because it is describing a past that the reader recognizes. The reader, encountering a document that matches historical reality with apparent precision, experiences what appears to be evidence of genuine supernatural knowledge. The technique works because prophecy is evaluated retrospectively. When you read a prophecy after the events it describes have occurred, you are reading it with the knowledge of those events already in your possession. You recognize the correspondence between the prophecy and the reality because you know the reality. The prophecy appears to have predicted it, but the prophecy may simply have described it in the compressed, symbolic, deliberately ambiguous language of prophetic writing, which is flexible enough to be applied to almost any set of events with sufficient ingenuity, and which was written after the events it appears to predict. Whoever composed the prophecy used this technique with considerable skill. The phrases assigned to the popes from Celestine II through Urban VII are not random. They are crafted with attention to the specific details of each pope's biography, his birthplace, his family name, his heraldic symbols, his pre-papal career, the circumstances of his election. They are written in the compressed, cryptic Latin that prophetic literature conventionally employed, short enough to be memorable, vague enough to accommodate multiple interpretations, but precise enough to allow specific connections to be drawn once the reader knows what to look for. And the reader always knows what to look for, because the reader already knows the history. Let us examine the technique in detail, because the detail is where the forgery becomes visible. The phrase assigned to Innocent II, the Pope to whom Malachy supposedly gave the prophecy in 1139, is ex castro Tiberis, from the castle of the Tiber. In Noscente was born Gregorio Papareschi. His family was from the Trastevere district of Rome, the district across the Tiber, the district on the other side of the river from the main city. His connection, Trastevere, across the Tiber, is the connection that the interpretation draws. It is a plausible connection, but notice what it requires. Knowledge of Innocent II's family background, specifically the neighborhood association of the Papareschi family with Trastevere. This is exactly the kind of biographical detail that would be available in Panvinio's Brief History of the Roman Pontiffs, published in 1557. The author of the Malachy prophecy read Panvinio, or a source like Panvinio, and then they wrote phrases that could be connected to the biographical details in Panvinio, using the compressed, symbolic language of prophetic writing that made the connections appear to be the product of supernatural foreknowledge rather than historical research. The phrases for the popes before 1590 are accurate because they are descriptions, not predictions. They are the product of historical research, not prophetic vision. Now consider what happens when the technique is applied to popes who had not yet been elected when the prophecy was written. The phrase assigned to Gregory XIV, the Pope elected in the conclave of 1590. The conclave in which the prophecy appeared is ex antiquitate urbis, from the ancient city. This phrase was apparently intended to apply to Simoncelli, from Orvieto. It did not, because Simoncelli was not elected. Gregory XIV, who was elected, was from Somma Lombardo. Interpretations that were subsequently proposed to connect ex antiquitate urbis to Gregory XIV are instructive in what they reveal about the difference between the technique applied to past popes and the technique applied to future ones. For past popes, the connection was specific. This phrase maps to this biographical detail, which you can verify in this historical source. The connection was there before the interpretation was proposed. The interpreter was finding it, not creating it. For future popes, popes who had not yet been elected when the phrase was written, there is no pre-existing biographical detail to map to. The interpreter must create the connection. This phrase could apply to this pope if you interpret it this way. If you read this word as referring to that quality, if you accept this etymological connection as the one the phrase intended, the interpretations become strained. They require ingenuity. They require the kind of motivated reading that produces connections because the reader wants to find them rather than because the connections are objectively there. This is the tell. A genuine prophecy, if such a thing were possible, would not require its interpreters to work harder for the popes who came after its writing than for the popes who came before. The difficulty of application would not correlate with the date of the prophecy's composition. The accuracy would not drop precipitously at the precise moment when post hoc description was no longer available as a technique. But the Malachy prophecy's accuracy does drop precipitously at exactly that moment, because it is not a prophecy. It is a description of the past, dressed in the language of prophecy and attributed to a saint who died 4 centuries before anyone had heard of it. Benito Jerónimo Feijó y Montenegro was born in Galicia, Spain, in 1676. He was a Benedictine monk, a professor of theology at the University of Oviedo. and one of the most important Spanish intellectuals of the 18th century, a man who spent his career attempting to introduce the methods of empirical investigation into a cultural environment that was, by the standards of the European Enlightenment, considerably more resistant to them than England or France or the German states. His Teatro Critico Universal, the Universal Critical Theatre, was a collection of essays on subjects ranging from natural philosophy to medicine to history to popular superstition, published in 8 volumes between 1724 and 1739. It was, for its time and place, a remarkable work, systematic, evidence-based, willing to challenge, received wisdom on subjects that other scholars had been reluctant to touch. One of the subjects he touched was the Malachy prophecy. Feijó's analysis of the prophecy was the most systematic that had been produced to that point, and it established the framework within which all subsequent scholarly analysis would operate. His method was simple and devastating. He compared the phrases assigned to the popes before 1590 with the available historical sources, and found that the accuracy of the prophecy was exactly the accuracy you would expect from someone who had read those sources and written descriptions based on what they found there. He then compared the phrases assigned to the popes after 1590 and found that the accuracy dropped to near zero. He also identified the specific source that the forger had used. Panvinio's Brief History of the Roman Pontiffs, published in 1557, contained the biographical information, birthplaces, family names, heraldic symbols, pre-papal careers that the Malachy prophecy's accurate early phrases drew upon. The correspondence between the information in Panvinio and the phrases in the prophecy was, as Feijó documented, systematic enough to constitute something very close to proof. The prophecy was written after 1557, using Panvinio as a source, by someone who wanted the phrases to appear to have been written in the 12th century. The technique of vaticinium ex eventu, applied with care and skill to 4 centuries of papal history. Feijó's conclusion was unambiguous. The Malachy prophecy was not a genuine 12th century document. It was a 16th century composition, almost certainly connected to the political circumstances of the 1590 conclave. His analysis was published in 1724. The prophecy continued to circulate. This is the fact that requires explanation, not the existence of the forgery. Forgeries exist, and the mechanisms by which they are constructed are well understood. Not the initial success of the forgery. The 1590 conclave was exactly the environment in which a forged prophetic document would find a receptive audience. Not even the forgery's survival into the 17th and 18th centuries, before the tools of historical criticism were sufficiently developed to produce the kind of systematic demolition that Feijó achieved. The fact that requires explanation is the forgery's survival after Feijó. After 1724, after a Spanish Benedictine monk had published a systematic, evidence-based demonstration that the prophecy was a 16th century composition with a 95% to 8% accuracy discontinuity at the precise moment of its claimed discovery, continued to circulate. It continued to be cited. It continued to be treated by significant numbers of people as potentially authentic. It continued to appear, with reliable consistency, at every moment of papal succession, in every language in which information about the papacy was communicated. It continues to circulate now. The explanation for this survival is not that Feijó was wrong. He was not wrong. His analysis has been confirmed by every subsequent scholar who has examined the document with appropriate rigor. The Catholic Encyclopedia, Catholic News Agency, the National Catholic Register, EWTN, the authoritative institutional voices of the Catholic Church itself have all confirmed, in language ranging from careful to direct, that the prophecy is not what it claims to be. The explanation is that the prophecy's circulation was never dependent on its authenticity. It was dependent on its function. And its function, the transformation of institutional uncertainty into sacred narrative. The conversion of the anxiety of not knowing who the next pope will be into the excitement of recognizing who the next pope was always going to be. This function does not require the document to be authentic. It requires only the moment to be anxious. And the moment is always anxious when a pope dies. There is a distinction that the history of the Malachy prophecy illuminates with particular clarity, a distinction between two different ways that a forged document can be used, and two different audiences it can serve. The first use is political. The document is deployed in a specific institutional context, a conclave, a disputed election, a moment of succession to advance the interests of a specific candidate or faction. The audience is the College of Cardinals, or whatever group of people has the authority to make the decision at stake. The purpose is influence, to tip the balance of a contested choice by adding a divine argument to the human ones. This is how the Malachy prophecy was apparently used in 1590, and if the 1587 letter is any guide, perhaps in earlier conclaves as well. It failed in this use. At least in 1590, Saint Malachy was not elected. The divine argument was not sufficient to overcome the human calculations that produced Gregory XIV. The second use is cultural. The document circulates beyond the specific institutional context for which it was produced, reaching an audience that has no direct role in the decision being made, but that has a strong interest in understanding what the decision means. The audience is the general population of believers, people who are not cardinals, who will not vote in the conclave, but who are invested in the outcome and who find in the prophetic document a resource for understanding what they are witnessing. This second use is the one that has sustained the Malachy prophecy for 5 centuries. The cardinals of 1590 were not significantly influenced by it. The cardinals of every subsequent conclave have had access to the scholarly analysis that identified it as a forgery, and have, as far as the record indicates, made their decisions on the basis of human calculation rather than prophetic consultation. But the people outside the Sistine Chapel, the people reading the newspapers, and then the pamphlets, and then the magazines, and then the websites, and then the social media feeds. These people have found the prophecy useful in a way that its political use was not, because the political use requires the document to be authentic enough to influence the decision-makers. The cultural use requires only that the document be interesting enough to be shared. And the Malachy prophecy is extraordinarily interesting. It is ancient. It is mysterious. It is specific enough to appear meaningful and vague enough to accommodate multiple interpretations. It connects the specific, contingent, humanly political event of a papal election to the largest possible narrative framework, the entire sweep of sacred history, from the 12th century to the Last Judgment. It tells you that what you are watching is not merely institutional politics. It tells you that what you are watching is the fulfillment of something that was written down before anyone alive was born. That is an extraordinarily compelling thing to be told. It is compelling regardless of whether it is true. It may be more compelling precisely because it is not verifiable, because the question of its authenticity is sufficiently contested that the believer can always find some scholar or some argument that preserves the possibility that it might be genuine, even if the weight of evidence suggests otherwise. The uncertainty is not a bug. It is the feature. A certainty that the prophecy is genuine would make it less interesting than a controversy about whether the prophecy is genuine, because a controversy requires engagement, and engagement is circulation, and circulation is the mechanism running. The phrase that the Malachy prophecy assigns to the final pope in the sequence number 112, the last one, the one whose reign will allegedly precede the destruction of Rome in the Last Judgment, is Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. The description given for this final pope is slightly longer than the sparse phrases assigned to the preceding 111. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman, who will feed his sheep through many tribulations. And when these things are finished, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the formidable judge will judge his people. The end. This phrase, more elaborate, more dramatic, more eschatologically explicit than anything else in the document, has a different quality than the phrases that precede it. It reads less like the compressed, biographical shorthand of the earlier entries and more like a conventional apocalyptic conclusion, the kind of ending that a forger, having written 111 relatively restrained phrases, might append to give the document its proper sense of finality. It is, in other words, the part of the prophecy that looks most like something someone wrote, but it is also the part of the prophecy that has generated the most intense public interest. Precisely because it is the part that has not yet been definitively applied to a specific pope. Every pope from Gregory XIV onward has been assigned a phrase. Most of those assignments have required interpretive ingenuity of varying degrees, but they have been made. The sequence has advanced, phrase by phrase, toward the final entry. And the final entry, Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman, has been waiting for 500 years. It is still waiting, and every time a pope dies, the waiting produces the same response, a search for the connections that would identify the new pope as Peter the Roman, or a reinterpretation of the sequence that would insert additional unnamed popes between the current one and the final entry, or an argument that the prophecy has already been fulfilled in a way that was not previously recognized. The mechanism does not need the prophecy to be fulfilled. It needs the expectation of fulfillment to be maintained, and maintained expectations do not require evidence. They require only the next conclave. In 1700, a man named Giovanni Francesco Albani was elected pope. He took the name Clement XI. He was 69 years old, a scholar and a diplomat, a man of genuine learning and considerable administrative experience. He had served in the papal bureaucracy for decades before his election, and he was, by the standards of the moment, a reasonable choice for a papacy that faced significant political challenges. The War of the Spanish Succession was about to begin, and the question of where the papacy stood in relation to the competing Catholic powers of Europe was one that would define his pontificate. These were the things that mattered about Clement XI. These were the things that historians of the early 18th century recorded and analyzed and argued about. But Clement XI is remembered in a different kind of history, for something else entirely. The phrase assigned to him in the Malachy prophecy was flores circumdati, surrounded by flowers. No one could figure out what this meant. The phrase did not connect obviously to Clement's name, or his birthplace, or his family, or his heraldic symbols, or any of the biographical details that had made the early phrases in the prophecy appear so accurate. The supporters of the prophecy's authenticity struggled to produce a connection that was not embarrassingly strained. And then Clement XI did something that resolved the problem. He had a coin struck. The coin bore the motto Flores Circumdati, the phrase from the Malachy prophecy, as its inscription. The Pope had incorporated the prophetic phrase into his public iconography. Whether this was a conscious act of fulfillment or a later interpretive opportunity is harder to say. But the effect is the same. The connection no longer exists only in the minds of interpreters. It enters the public record. This moment, a pope actively constructing the connection between himself and a prophetic phrase, rather than passively embodying it, is the moment that reveals something essential about how the Malachy prophecy functioned in the centuries after its publication. Not merely as a document that people read and interpreted, as a framework that people participated in, that they shaped themselves to fit, that they used to construct the meaning of their own pontificates. A forgery had become, for the popes it described, a script. To understand how a forged document becomes a script, how it transitions from something that is applied to events from outside to something that shapes events from inside, you need to understand the specific institutional context in which the Malachy prophecy circulated after 1595. The institutional context was the papacy itself. Every pope elected after the prophecy's publication was, from the moment of his election, confronted with the fact of the prophecy's existence and the question of which phrase applied to him. This confrontation was not always willing. Some popes ignored the prophecy. Some dismissed it. Some, like the institutional church itself, treated it with the carefully calibrated skepticism of people who could not endorse it and found it inconvenient to condemn it outright. But the confrontation was unavoidable. Because the prophecy was public, it had been published. It was being read and discussed and applied and misapplied by a Catholic population that had access to it through print, the technology that had transformed the circulation of information in Europe since Gutenberg, and that the Malachy prophecy was one of the early beneficiaries of in its post-1595 form. And within that public confrontation, some popes made the same choice that Clement XI made. They engaged. They examined the phrase assigned to them and found, or allowed others to find, connections between that phrase and elements of their biography or pontificate. In some cases, later interpreters argued that papal names, heraldic symbols, or iconographic choices aligned strikingly with the prophetic phrase, whether those alignments were deliberate, encouraged, or retrospective is harder to establish. They did this for reasons that are not difficult to understand. The authority of a pope is, in the medieval and early modern understanding of the office, ultimately divine. A pope is the vicar of Christ, the representative of God on earth, speaking with divine authority on matters of faith and morals. The institutional church goes to considerable lengths to establish and maintain this understanding of papal authority, because the authority of the papacy is the authority of the institution, and the institution's power depends on that authority being accepted. A prophecy that identifies a specific pope as the divinely appointed holder of the office, that says, in effect, this man was known to God centuries before his birth, and his elevation was part of the divine plan, reinforces this authority in ways that no institutional argument can match. It says, this is not merely a human choice. It is a recognition. The popes who engaged with the Malachy prophecy were not, in most cases, cynically manipulating a useful fiction. They were operating within a framework of understanding about the nature of papal authority that made the prophetic endorsement genuinely meaningful to them. If the prophecy was authentic, if Saint Malachy had genuinely foreseen their pontificates, then the connection between the prophetic phrase and their biography was not a coincidence. It was a sign, and signs, in the theological vocabulary of the post-Tridentine Church, were taken seriously. The pattern of papal engagement with the Malachy prophecy, the pattern that Clement XI's coin exemplified, repeated itself across the centuries with a consistency that is itself significant. Pope Paul V, who reigned from 1605 to 1621, was assigned the phrase Peregrinus Apostolicus, the apostolic pilgrim. His family name was Borghese, and the Borghese coat of arms featured a dragon and an eagle, symbols of movement, of travel, of the pilgrim's journey. The connection was made. The phrase was applied. The prophecy was, once again, confirmed. Pope Urban Ep.03, who reigned from 1623 to 1644, was assigned Lilium et Rosa, the lily and the rose. Urban VIII was from Florence, the city of the lily, whose fleur-de-lis symbol was everywhere in its civic iconography. He was also, as it happened, a poet, a man who wrote verses and who appreciated the symbolic resonance of flowers. The connection was made. Pope Alexander Shapti, who reigned from 1655 to 1667, was assigned Montium Castus, guardian of the mountains. Alexander VII's family, the Chigi, had mountains on their coat of arms. The connection was made. Pope Ep.03, who reigned from 1878 to 1903, one of the longest pontificates in modern history, was assigned lumen, Encailo, light in the sky. Leo XIII's coat of arms featured a shooting star. He was aware of the prophecy. He was, by multiple accounts, interested in it. The connection between his heraldic shooting star and the prophetic light in the sky was noted and appreciated. In each of these cases, and the list continues through the 20th century and into the 21st, the connection between the prophetic phrase and the Pope's biography or iconography was not purely the product of retrospective application. It was shaped, at least in part, by the Pope's own awareness of the phrase and his willingness to incorporate it into his self-presentation. The prophecy was influencing the popes it described, not by telling them what to do, by giving them a framework for how to understand and present what they were already doing. This is a feedback loop that the forger of 1590 did not anticipate and could not have planned for. The forgery had been designed to influence a specific election. It failed to do so. But in failing to influence the election, it escaped the specific context for which it was designed and entered a much larger context, the context of papal self-understanding across centuries. And in that larger context, it did something more durable than influencing a conclave. It became part of the way popes thought about themselves, part of the script. The most striking example of papal engagement with the Malachy prophecy, the example that reveals most clearly how deep the feedback loop ran, is not Clement XI's coin, or Leo XIII's shooting star, or any of the more celebrated instances of papal self-identification with prophetic phrases. It is a pattern that Unam Sanctam Catholicam, in its analysis of the prophecy's history, documented with particular care. The pattern of popes choosing their papal coats of arms in ways that fulfilled, or appeared to fulfill, the prophetic phrase assigned to their number in the sequence. The choice of a papal coat of arms is not a trivial decision. It is an act of self-definition, a selection of symbols that will represent the pontificate, that will appear on official documents and buildings and coins, that will be associated with the Pope's name and memory for as long as the historical record preserves them. When a Pope chooses a coat of arms that connects to the Malachy phrase assigned to his number in the sequence, he is making a decision about how his pontificate will be understood within his own lifetime, by his contemporaries, and by the posterity that will read the prophetic connections into his iconographic choices. He is, in effect, being written into the prophecy or allowing himself to be written into it, not by authenticating the text, but by participating in the interpretive framework around it. This is how forgeries become true, not in the historical sense, in the social one. A phrase written about no identifiable future pope is later attached to a real one. That pope, or the culture around him, incorporates the phrase into the symbols through which the pontificate is understood. The phrase then appears to describe something real, not because it predicted the future, but because later actors helped make the connection legible. The prophecy is not authenticated, it is enacted. There is a moment in the history of the Malachy prophecy that serves as the clearest possible illustration of what happens when the feedback loop between the prophecy and the papacy reaches its maximum intensity. It is not a dramatic moment. It does not involve a conclave, or a disputed election, or a pope struck by the sudden realization that a centuries-old document had predicted his pontificate. It is a quiet moment, a moment of private consultation, reported by multiple sources, that reveals the depth of the prophecy's integration into the institutional life of the papacy. The moment is this. There are persistent anecdotal reports that some newly elected popes, or people around them, consulted the Malachy prophecy privately. Not all popes, not officially, not as part of any formal institutional procedure, but across multiple centuries. Memoirs, correspondence, and later accounts suggest that the phrase assigned to a new pope was sometimes examined and discussed in private. These reports are difficult to verify systematically. What they suggest, however, is not a formal practice but a recurring pattern of unofficial engagement. A practice of private engagement with a document that the institutional church has consistently described as unauthenticated and unworthy of credence. The institutional church says, "This document is not approved. It is not endorsed. Catholics are not required to give it credence." And then the Pope reads it, privately, without institutional acknowledgement, with the curiosity of a man who has just been placed at the center of a framework he did not design, looking for clues about what that framework says his role is supposed to be. This is the mechanism at its most intimate. Not the crowds sharing the prophecy on the internet. Not the newspapers running headlines about the last pope. Not the theologians debating the document's authenticity in academic journals. A man, alone, reading a list that someone wrote in 1590, about him, before he was born, looking for himself in it. The 20th century produced the most intense public engagement with the Malachy prophecy that the document had experienced since its publication in 1595. The reason is simple. The 20th century produced mass communication. The printing press had made the prophecy available to literate Europeans after 1595. The telegraph and the newspaper made it available to literate populations across the world in the 19th century. The radio and the television made it available to populations who had never read the document but who could hear it discussed and interpreted by voices that reached into their living rooms. And the internet made it available to everyone. Instantly. At the moment of maximum anxiety, the moment when a pope died and the world was waiting to see who would emerge from the Sistine Chapel, each papal death in the 20th century produced a new wave of Malachy prophecy circulation. Each conclave produced a new round of interpretation, application, and debate. Each new pope produced a new search for the connection between his biography and the phrase assigned to his number in the sequence. The wave that followed Pope John Paul II's death in 2005 was significant. The wave that followed Benedict XVI's resignation in 2013 was larger. The wave that followed Pope Francis's death in April 2025 was the largest yet because the technology for sharing information had continued to develop. And because Francis was number 111 inches, the sequence, and because the phrase assigned to number 112 Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman, had been waiting for 500 years, the conclave of May 2025 met in the Sistine Chapel. The Malachy prophecy was everywhere, on news websites, on social media platforms, in the comment sections of articles about the conclave, in dedicated threads and channels and communities that had been tracking the prophecy's fulfillment for years and were now certain or nearly certain, or hopeful, or anxious that the moment had arrived. The new pope was elected. He was not named Peter. The reinterpretations began within hours. His middle name, his family's regional origins, the symbolic meaning of the name he chose, the connection between his pontificate's stated priorities and the description of Peter the Roman feeding his sheep through tribulations. Each reinterpretation was shared. Each reinterpretation generated discussion. Each discussion generated more sharing. The mechanism ran, as it had run in 1590, in the Sistine Chapel, when the phrase ex antiquitate urbis was presented to a college of cardinals and connected to a candidate from Orvieto, as it had run in 1724. When Fagel published his systematic demolition of the prophecy and the prophecy continued to circulate, as it had run in 1595. When Arnold Wion published a document that someone had written sometime around 1590, attributed it to a saint who had been dead for 4.5 centuries, and sent it into the world. The document apparently written for one conclave is now shadowed, framed, or resurfaced around many more, not by being authentic, by being available, at exactly the moments when availability is most valuable. There is a question that the history of the Malachy prophecy's institutional life raises a question about the relationship between the forgery and the institution it has been forged onto that is more uncomfortable than the question of why people believe it. The question is, what does it mean for an institution when a document that claims to describe the entire future of that institution becomes part of the way the institution understands itself? The Catholic Church has officially declined to endorse the Malachy prophecy. It has been identified as a forgery by the Church's own authoritative voices. It is not part of the official teaching of the Church, not cited in any magisterial document, not incorporated into any liturgical or devotional practice that the Church officially sanctions. And yet, there are repeated anecdotal reports that some popes read it, and later commentators often linked papal heraldry, iconography, or public symbolism to the phrase assigned in the prophecy. The Catholic population and far beyond the Catholic population has treated the document, generation after generation, as a framework for interpreting moments of papal succession. The institution has officially rejected the document, yet the document has continued to shadow the way parts of the institution and many of its observers. Imagine the papacy. This is not hypocrisy. It is the operation of a distinction that institutions maintain, necessarily and sometimes productively, between what they officially endorse and what they actually use. The official position manages the institution's relationship with historical scholarship and theological rigor. The unofficial practice manages the institution's relationship with the human need for narrative, meaning the need that the forgery was designed to answer and that the forgery has been answering, with remarkable consistency. For 500 years, the official position says this is not what it claims to be. The unofficial practice says it is useful anyway. Both are true, and the tension between them, the tension between the institution's commitment to historical accuracy and its members' need for prophetic narrative, is not a tension that can be resolved by exposing the forgery. It can only be managed, which is what the Church has been doing since 1724, managing the tension. While the mechanism runs, in 1880, a Catholic priest named M.J. O'Brien wrote a monograph on the Malachy prophecy. His conclusion was unsparing. The prophecies had served no purpose. They were absolutely meaningless. The Latin was bad. It was impossible to attribute such absurd triflings to any holy source. The attempts to explain the prophecies after 1590 were, in his words, the sorriest trifling. The monograph was published. It was read by scholars. It was ignored by everyone else, because O'Brien was answering the wrong question. He was asking, is the prophecy authentic? The people who were sharing it were not asking that question. They were asking, does the prophecy help me understand what is happening? And the answer to that question for a significant number of people, across 5 centuries, in every language in which the document has been available, has been yes. Not because the prophecy is accurate, because it is organizing. It takes the confusion of institutional succession, the anxiety of not knowing who will emerge from the locked room and what their emergence will mean, and places it inside a framework that makes the confusion purposeful. The confusion is not chaos. It is the penultimate chapter of a story that was written centuries ago and is moving toward its conclusion. You are not watching an institution navigate a political transition. You are watching history arrive at its destination. These are very different experiences of the same event, and the forgery makes the second experience available. at exactly the moments when the first experience is most anxious. That is why it has been alive for 500 years. That is why it will be alive for the next conclave, and the one after that, and the one after that, until the mechanism finds something it cannot absorb, which, in 500 years, it has not found yet. On April 12, uncannily, Pope Francis died. He was 88 years old. He had reigned for 12 years, a pontificate long enough to have defined an era, to have changed the tone and, in some respects, the direction of the institutional church, to have generated both the fierce loyalty of those who saw in him a renewal and the fierce opposition of those who saw in him a deviation. He had been born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, the son of Italian immigrants from the Piedmont region. He had been a Jesuit before he was a bishop before he was a cardinal before he was a pope. He had taken the name Francis after the man who had crossed the lines at Damietta in 1219, after the man who had sat down with Alcamo, after the man who had tried to demonstrate that there was an alternative to prophetic certainty. He was number 111 inches, the Malachy sequence. He was the second to last. Within hours of the announcement of his death, the Malachy prophecy was everywhere. Not in the way that it had been everywhere after Benedict XVI's resignation in 2013, though that moment had been significant. And the prophecy circulation then had been extensive. This time it was more intense, more urgent, more specifically focused on the phrase that had been waiting at the end of the list for 500 years. Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman, the last pope, the one whose reign would precede the destruction of Rome and the last judgment. The conclave was coming. The mechanism was running. Let us look at the phrase with the attention it deserves. Not the attention of a believer, the attention of someone trying to understand how the phrase functions, what it does, why it has exercised such persistent fascination across 5 centuries of papal history. The phrase is this: in persecutione extrema sanctae Romanae, ecclesiae sedebit Petrus Romanus, qui passetov in multis tribulationibus, quibus transactis civitas septicolis diruetur, et iude extremendus iude gabet populum sum. Finis. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, Peter the Roman will sit, or will feed his sheep through many tribulations. And when these things are finished, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the formidable judge will judge his people. The end. Several things are immediately notable about this phrase when compared to the 111 that preceded. First, it is longer, much longer. The preceding phrases are brief, 2 or 3 words, occasionally 4 or 5, compressed to the point of crypticism. This final entry is a full sentence, almost a paragraph. It has a narrative structure. It tells a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is more explicit. The preceding phrases are deliberately ambiguous, designed to be applicable to multiple possible popes with sufficient interpretive ingenuity. This final entry is not ambiguous. It specifies a name, a role, a sequence of events, and their conclusion. The city of 7 hills, Rome, will be destroyed. The formidable judge will judge his people. The end. Third, it is eschatological in a way that the preceding phrases are not. The preceding phrases describe individual popes, their origins, their symbols, their character. This final entry describes the end of history. These differences are consistent with what you would expect from a forger who had written 111 restrained biographical phrases and then needed to provide a conclusion, an ending that justified the entire sequence, that gave the list its sense of purpose and finality. that transformed a collection of biographical curiosities into a prophetic document with cosmic stakes. The ending was written to be memorable. It succeeded. The search for Peter the Roman began before Francis was elected and has not ended now that he is dead. It began in its modern form. In 2012, a year before Benedict XVI's resignation, in a book called Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here, published by two American authors named Tom Horn and Chris Putnam. The book argued, with the enthusiasm of people who had found a pattern that seemed to confirm what they already believed, that the Malachy prophecy was genuine, that Francis's predecessor, Benedict XVI, was number 111, and that the next pope would be Peter the Roman, the last pope, the pope of the end times. The book was published in 2012. Benedict XVI resigned in February 2013. The timing appeared, to the book's readers and to the people who encountered its arguments in the days after Benedict's resignation, to be confirmation. The prophecy had been right. The sequence was advancing. The final chapter was beginning. The conclave elected Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He took the name Francis. He was not named Peter. His middle name, Mario, was examined. The name Mario does not obviously connect to Peter. His family origins, Italian immigrants, specifically from Piedmont, were examined. Piedmont is not Rome, but Italy is close enough. And the Bergoglios had maintained Italian citizenship. And there is a stretch of interpretive logic by which an Argentine-born man of Italian descent could be described as Roman in some meaningful sense. The reinterpretations were generated quickly and shared widely. They were also, by any standard of honest textual analysis, strained. Francis was not Peter the Roman. He was not named Peter. He was not Roman in any direct sense. His pontificate, for all its significance, did not end with the destruction of Rome or the Last Judgment. He reigned for 12 years. He died of natural causes. Rome was not destroyed. The prophecy was wrong. Again, the wrongness of the prophecy did not end its circulation. This should not be surprising. We have established, across the previous 4 hui of this episode, that the Malachy prophecy's circulation has never been dependent on its accuracy. It circulated before Feijóo proved it was a forgery. It circulated after Feijóo proved it was a forgery. It circulated after O'Brien called it absolutely meaningless in 1880. It circulated after the Catholic Encyclopedia declined to endorse it. It circulated after Catholic News Agency, National Catholic Register, and EWTN all confirmed that the evidence was consistent with a forgery composed around 1590. The wrongness of a specific application has never ended the prophecy's general circulation. What it has done every time a specific application has failed, is produce a new round of interpretation, a new reading of the phrase that accommodates the failure, a new argument for why the failure was not, in fact, a failure, but a misunderstanding of what the phrase was predicting. After Francis was elected and the Peter the Roman identification failed, the arguments moved in several directions simultaneously. Some argue that Francis was Peter the Roman, correctly identified that the connections to Peter and to Rome were real, even if they required interpretive effort to establish. The reinterpretations of his name, his family origins, and the symbolic content of his pontificate were developed and refined over the 12 years of his reign, with each significant event in his pontificate being read through the lens of the final phrase's description of tribulations and feeding the sheep. Some argued that the sequence was not 111 and 112, but that there were additional unnamed popes between the last named entry and the final Petrus Romanus, that the sequence had been misread. That Francis was not number 111 but some earlier number, and that the final pope was still to come. Some argued that the prophecy was not literal but symbolic, that Petrus Romanus did not refer to a specific individual pope, but to the papacy itself in its final form, to the institutional church in its last period before the eschaton. Each of these arguments was circulated. Each generated discussion. Each kept the prophecy in the conversation. And then Francis died. And the conclave was called. And the arguments intensified. And the mechanism ran. The conclave of May 2025 met in circumstances that the Malachy prophecy had, in a sense, been preparing for 500 years. The death of the Pope, who was widely understood to be number 111. The imminent election of the Pope, who would be number 112. The 500-year-old phrase waiting to be applied. The global audience connected by the technology that had made the prophecy's circulation more extensive than at any previous moment in its history, watching and sharing and debating and waiting. It was, from the perspective of the mechanism, a perfect moment. The anxiety was at its maximum. The expectation was at its maximum. The need for narrative, for the assurance that what was happening was not merely institutional politics but sacred history, was at its maximum. And the mechanism delivered. The prophecy was shared by millions of people in the days before and after the conclave. It was discussed in mainstream news outlets alongside the more straightforwardly political coverage of the election. It was the subject of dedicated content across every platform that exists for the production and distribution of content. It reached people who had never heard of it before and people who had been tracking it for years. People who believed it and people who were skeptical and people who were somewhere in the complicated middle where most human beings actually live on questions like this. And then the conclave elected a new pope, and the search for the connections began, as it always begins, as it will always begin, because the mechanism is not running toward a conclusion. The mechanism is the conclusion. Here is what the history of the Malachy prophecy is actually the history of. Not the history of a forged document. Not the history of a specific political gambit that failed and then escaped its original context and took on a life its creator had not planned for. Not even the history of the specific human need the document has been answering for 500 years. It is the history of a particular relationship between institutions and the people who belong to them. The relationship between the official and the unofficial. Between what is acknowledged and what is used. Between the story that the institution tells about itself and the story that its members need to tell themselves about it. The Catholic Church is, by any measure, an extraordinary institution. It has survived for 2,000 years through political upheavals, military catastrophes, theological controversies, and internal scandals that would have destroyed most organizations within a generation. It has done this by maintaining, simultaneously, a rigorous official theology and a flexible popular practice by being, at the level of official teaching, an institution committed to doctrinal precision and historical accuracy, and being, at the level of popular engagement, an institution that can accommodate the full range of human need for meaning and mystery and the assurance that the universe has a shape. The Malachy prophecy exists in the space between the official and the unofficial. It is not endorsed. It is not taught. It is not incorporated into the liturgy or the catechism or any of the official structures through which the Church transmits its teaching to its members. It is shared. It is consulted. It is used by popes who read it privately and shaped their coats of arms in response to it. By bishops who mention it in sermons without quite endorsing it. By the Catholic population and far beyond the Catholic population who retrieve it from whatever medium is currently available every time a pope dies, and find in it a framework for understanding what is happening to an institution they care about. The institution cannot endorse it. The institution cannot eliminate it. So the institution manages it. And the management has been going on for 500 years. While the mechanism runs, there is a detail about the Malachy prophecy that tends to be overlooked in the standard accounts, a detail that illuminates, with particular clarity, the nature of the mechanism, and the specific need it answers. The detail is this. The prophecy is not interesting to everyone who encounters it. Most people who hear about the Malachy prophecy for the first time, who are told that a document claims to list every pope until the end of the world, and that the list appears accurate for the popes before 1590 and inaccurate for the popes after, and that the document is almost certainly a forgery composed around 1590, most of these people respond with mild interest and then move on. The prophecy is a curiosity, an interesting footnote in the history of the Church, not something that organizes their understanding of the world or generates the kind of urgent, sharing engagement that keeps a document alive across 5 centuries. The people for whom the prophecy is more than a curiosity, the people who return to it at every moment of papal succession, who track the applications of the phrases, who debate the connections, who share the prophecy at moments of maximum anxiety. These people have something in common that is more specific than simple credulity or a general tendency toward conspiratorial thinking. They have a stake in the institution, a stake in its future, a stake in the question of what the election of the next pope will mean for the direction of the Church and, through the Church, for the direction of the world. The Malachy prophecy is interesting to people who care about the papacy, not because it is accurate, because it transforms caring about the papacy from a purely institutional engagement into a cosmic one. It says, your concern for this institution is not merely personal or political. It is connected to the largest possible narrative, the narrative of sacred history moving toward its conclusion. Your anxiety about the conclave is not just anxiety. It is participation in prophecy. And participation in prophecy is a different experience from watching institutional politics. It is a better experience, in the specific sense that it is more meaningful, more organized, more reassuring in its implication that what is happening has been planned, that it is moving towards something, that the conclusion has already been written even if it has not yet arrived. This is the need the forgery answers, not the need to know the future. The need to believe the future is knowable. The need to believe that the institution you care about is not merely stumbling from one contingent human choice to the next, but moving with whatever difficulties and delays and failures of specific individuals toward a destination that was fixed before any of the individuals currently involved were born. The forgery cannot provide this assurance truthfully, but it can provide it, and the provision is sufficient, which is why it has been running for 500 years, and why it will run for 500 more. Unless something changes that is more fundamental than the next exposure of the forgery's inauthenticity. Something that addresses not the document's accuracy, but the need it answers. That something does not yet exist, which means the mechanism runs. There is a final observation about the Malachy prophecy that belongs not to the history of the document, but to the history of the response to it, the history of the people and institutions who have tried to stop it, to debunk it, to limit its circulation and its influence. The attempts have been consistent. They have been, in their scholarly dimensions, successful. The forgery has been exposed, repeatedly and comprehensively, by people with the tools and the evidence to do it. The case against the prophecy's authenticity is, by the standards of historical scholarship, as close to proven as historical scholarship can get. The attempts have also been, in their practical dimensions, failures. The prophecy circulates today more widely than it circulated in 1595. The technology that has made information more accessible has made the debunking of the prophecy more accessible too, and has made the prophecy itself vastly more accessible. The net effect of greater information availability has been, for the Malachy prophecy, a dramatic increase in circulation. This is the paradox of debunking prophetic misinformation in an environment of abundant information. The debunking is available. It is accurate. It is well sourced and carefully argued. Anyone who wants to understand why the Malachy prophecy is almost certainly a 16th century forgery can find that understanding within minutes of looking for it. And the prophecy is also available. It is dramatic. It is organized around a narrative of cosmic significance. It connects the specific anxiety of a specific moment to the largest possible framework of meaning. Anyone who wants to feel that the conclave they are watching is not merely institutional politics but sacred history can find that feeling within seconds of looking for it. The debunking is accurate. The prophecy is useful, and in an environment where both are equally available. Usefulness competes very effectively with accuracy. This is not a new problem. It is the oldest problem in the history of misinformation. It was the problem in 1294, when the angelic Pope narrative was more useful than the accurate assessment of Pietro di Morone's administrative capabilities. It was the problem in 1219, when the prophetic certainty of total victory was more useful than the accurate assessment of the military situation at Damietta. It was the problem in 1590, when a forged list of papal phrases was more useful to the supporters of a conclave candidate than any argument they could have made on his merits. The mechanism does not win by being more accurate than the truth. It wins by being more useful than the truth, and the usefulness is real. This is the thing that the most rigorous debunking always struggles to account for. The need that the mechanism answers is genuine. The anxiety it transforms is genuine. The desire to believe that the institution you care about is moving towards something rather than simply moving this desire is not pathological or weak or the product of insufficient critical thinking. It is human. And the Malachy prophecy, the document that someone wrote around 1590, that described the past as if it were the future, that appeared in a conclave at exactly the right moment and then escaped into the world and never came back. This document has been answering that human need for 500 years. Not because it is true, because it is there, at every moment when the need is most acute, which is every moment when a pope dies. And popes, despite the best efforts of the mechanism to suggest otherwise, are mortal. Which means there will always be a next conclave, which means the mechanism will always have its moment, which means it will always run. In May 2025, the College of Cardinals elected a new pope. The world watched. The Malachy prophecy was shared. The new pope took a name. The searches began. Was the name connected to Peter? Were his family origins connected to Rome? And his biography? His heraldic symbols. His stated priorities connect to the phrase Petrus Romanus in any of the ways that creative interpretation could establish? Some said yes. Some said no. Most said maybe. If you read it this way, the debate was shared. The prophecy circulated. The mechanism ran, as it had run when Urban VII died after 13 days and the second conclave of 1590 opened in October, and a manuscript appeared that someone had written and placed in an archive and attributed to a saint who had been dead for 4.5 centuries, as it will run at the next conclave, and the one after that, because the document that was forged to influence one election has now outlived every person who was in the room when it appeared. It has outlived every scholar who debunked it. It has outlived every pope it has been applied to. It has outlived every institutional assessment of its inauthenticity. It will outlive us. Not because it is true, because it answers a need that does not go away. The oldest weapon in history has no blade. It has a list of 112 names, written by no one, attributed to a saint, applied to a future that keeps arriving without fulfilling it, and shared every time by millions of people who know or could know. If they looked at the list was written around 1590 by a person whose name we do not know, for a purpose that failed, and who share it anyway, because the next conclave is coming, and they want to know what comes next. And the list says it knows, even though it doesn't, even though it never did, even though the saint whose name it bears never wrote a word of it, and his friend, who was with him when he died and wrote everything down, never mentioned it. Not once. There is a shelf in the Vatican secret archives. On that shelf, or near it, or in a location that has never been precisely identified, a manuscript was supposedly found in 1590. The manuscript was a list of 112 phrases in Latin, each one describing a future pope, attributed to a 12th century Irish saint whose closest friend had written his biography and not mentioned the list. The manuscript was used in a conclave. It did not influence the outcome. It was published 5 years later by a Flemish Benedictine monk who may not have known it was a forgery. It was read by millions of people over the next 4 centuries. It was systematically debunked by a Spanish monk in 1724. It continued to circulate. It was confirmed as almost certainly a forgery by the Catholic Church's own authoritative voices. It continued to circulate. In April, 2015, the Pope, who was number 111, died. The list was retrieved from its digital archive and shared, simultaneously, by millions of people on every platform that exists for the sharing of things. In May 2025, a new Pope was elected. He was number 112. The searches for Peter the Roman began within hours. They have not concluded. The shelf in the Vatican's secret archives is still there. Whether the manuscript is still on it, whether it ever was on it, whether it was ever in the Vatican at all, is a question that the historical record does not answer. The manuscript itself is not the point. The mechanism is the point. The mechanism does not need the manuscript. It needs the next conclave, which is always coming. The oldest weapon in history has no blade. It has a list. And the list says, you are living at the end of something. And people across 5 centuries, in every language, on every medium that has existed for the transmission of information, have been willing to believe that. Because it feels true, even when it isn't. Even when the saint never wrote it. Even when the friend never mentioned it. Even when the numbers say 95% before, 8% after. Even then, the mechanism runs.